The morning of the engagement dinner felt like any other, though something in the air felt off. I moved around our downtown apartment in silence, pouring coffee and slicing fruit with mechanical precision. Jeffrey hadn't mentioned anything about plans for the evening, so I assumed it would be a quiet night in. He sat at the marble island, absorbed in his laptop, tapping away with the intense focus he only showed when trying to impress someone important. When I asked about Christina's engagement dinner, he didn't even look up. Before I continue narrating the story of Nicole Richardson, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. "Oh, that was yesterday. Just immediate family," he said, as if that explained everything. I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "Yesterday?" I repeated, watching his fingers pause for a split second. "Yeah, Christina didn't want anything too big," he added, sipping from the mug I had just refilled. The way he avoided my eyes told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. I had helped pay for the photographer for that dinner, a $1,500 invoice Jeffrey had slipped into our joint account weeks earlier. He'd pitched it like it was something we were doing together, like partners. "Christina deserves to have the moment captured beautifully," he'd said with that practiced enthusiasm he used whenever he wanted something from me. I had agreed, thinking it would make her feel celebrated, thinking I'd be there. Now I was realizing that celebration had never included me. I stood frozen in our kitchen, my fingers curled tightly around the edge of the granite counter. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights looked soft and dreamy, like a world far removed from mine. Jeffrey was back to typing, unfazed, as if dropping a bomb on our marriage hadn't happened 5 minutes ago. "I see," I said finally, retreating to our bedroom under the weight of that simple omission. In the silence that followed, I could hear the unspoken truth loud and clear. This wasn't new. It was a pattern I'd let go unchecked for too long. I thought of Christina's boutique launch, how she had leaned on me for business advice and branding consultation. I had spent hours helping her, connecting her with suppliers and refining her marketing strategy, but I hadn't been invited to the boutique's launch party. I'd only seen it through photos on Instagram, smiling faces, champagne flutes, and not one hint of the woman who helped it all come together. At work, I was Nicole Richardson, a respected marketing executive with a sharp mind and a corner office. At home, I was the silent investor, the financial safety net, the afterthought. My job paid the mortgage, the utilities, the car note on the luxury sedan. Jeffrey insisted he needed for client appearances. His version of consulting was little more than endless coffee meetings, networking events, and vision boards. My version was results, clients, and actual revenue. The next few days passed in a haze of obligation. I nodded through board meetings, reviewed campaign pitches, and replied to congratulatory emails about our latest client acquisition. But inside, something was unraveling. I was calculating years of contributions measured against years of social exclusion. Family holidays where I cooked the meals but wasn't listed in the group chat. Gifts I paid for but wasn't credited for giving. Events I funded but never attended. Then came the call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening, 8:47 p.m., and I was standing in our marble-countered kitchen again. My phone buzzed with Jeffrey's name flashing on the screen. I answered without greeting. "Nicole, my card just got declined. At Harrison's dinner. What's going on?" I could hear the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of high-stakes conversation in the background. His voice had that panicked strain he tried to mask with professionalism. "The team is right here," he said through gritted teeth. "I need you to call the bank and fix this now." I closed my eyes and inhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me. "I must have forgotten," I said, voice calm as glass. "Just like you forgot your wife when you planned that dinner." The line went dead silent, not just from Jeffrey, but from everything. Our marriage, our home, my patience. In that moment, I wasn't the quiet background character anymore. I was the woman flipping the script. The silence stretched longer than it should have. I could hear him breathing on the other end, rapid and shaky. "Nicole, this isn't the time for games," he whispered, clearly trying to avoid a scene. "I need you to fix this, now." But I was done fixing things for someone who never fixed anything for me. "I think you should handle this one yourself," I replied. Then I hung up. The power in that click was electric. I stood in the center of our expensive kitchen, surrounded by all the things my salary had built, and for the first time I felt seen by myself. Jeffrey didn't come home that night, or the next. He sent me a text the following morning, claiming he was staying with a friend to give us both space. I ignored it. I wasn't interested in space. I was interested in clarity. So I did what I do best. I opened my laptop and got to work. Not for the Morrison account or the board presentation, but for me. I started listing every financial transaction I had made for his family in the last 2 years. Photographers, caterers, gift cards, boutique branding, tax consultations. Every dollar, every hour, every act of invisible labor. It was a longer list than I expected. The spreadsheet grew with every line I added, a forensic map of my erasure. I tracked transactions with cold precision, matching dates and receipts to memories that had once seemed benign. There was the $800 floral invoice for Margaret's birthday dinner, where I played hostess to 20 guests who never once asked how my work was going. I found the $400 gift card Jeffrey gave Michael for helping with the house, a task I had actually done while Jeffrey was out networking. I even found the invoice for the celebratory dinner after Christina's boutique hit its first month sales goals, $1, $200 billed to my card, a meal I hadn't been invited to attend. My jaw tightened as the pattern became impossible to ignore. I wasn't just excluded, I was leveraged. My success funded their milestones while I stood quietly outside the frame, uncredited. And somehow, I had been complicit in my own disappearance, mistaking silence for support and generosity for love. But silence, I was learning, was a form of erasure too. I took screenshots of every transaction and attached them to individual email drafts addressed to myself. It wasn't about confrontation, not yet. It was about preserving evidence, reminding myself that this story wasn't something I imagined. When people asked how a marriage falls apart, they expected drama, infidelity, something explosive. But sometimes it's just years of being overlooked until you don't recognize your reflection anymore. The next morning, Jeffrey returned as if nothing had happened. He came in quietly, setting his keys down and muttering something about client stress. I didn't look up from my coffee, and he didn't offer an apology. "About Tuesday," he said cautiously, settling onto the edge of the sectional. "It was just a glitch. I called the bank and they said the payment hadn't processed. I let the lie sit there between us like a rotting fruit. I could have corrected him, could have said there was no glitch, only my hand pulling the plug, but I was curious what story he would build around the wreckage." I said, sipping. "Weird timing." He seemed relieved by my lack of confrontation, mistaking my quiet for retreat. "I mean, it was embarrassing," he added, his tone shifting to wounded. "I had to put the whole thing on a personal card," the team noticed. Not a great look. I nodded sympathetically, the way I used to when our mortgage payment auto-drafted while his clients flaked. Then came the part one was waiting for, but I think they were still impressed. "I really think something's going to come of this." His eyes brightened with that dangerous optimism, the same delusion that had burned through tens of thousands of dollars, while producing nothing but networking contacts and glossy pitch decks. "We just need to stay the course," he said, as if this were a joint voyage. I set my mug down gently. "Jeffrey," I said, my voice measured and low, "I think we should schedule some time this weekend to go over our finances." His smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah, sure, we haven't done that in a while." That was a lie, too. We had never done it. I had done it. Alone. That night, while he snored beside me, I emailed my attorney. It wasn't a dramatic move. Not yet. I wasn't looking for a divorce. I was looking for leverage, options, language. I asked for a consultation to understand my rights regarding shared accounts, assets, and debts. I asked what it would take to protect myself without blowing up the structure I had built. The following day brought another twist. Christina called. Her tone was overly sweet, the kind of sugary carefulness people use when they know they've done something wrong. "Nicole, I've been meaning to reach out." she said, like she hadn't actively excluded me from the most important dinner of her adult life. I wanted to thank you for contributing to the photographer. It meant so much. I stood in my office, staring at the skyline through the window, one hand clenching the back of my chair. That's kind of you to say, I replied, letting her continue. The photos turned out so good, she gushed. Everyone looked amazing. You'll see them on Instagram soon. Of course I would. Instagram was where I always found out what my money had paid for. Christina hesitated. I hope you weren't upset you couldn't make it. Jeff said you had a work conflict. My laugh was dry, involuntary. Oh, I said, my voice all pleasant edge. That's interesting. I don't remember RSVPing either way. There was a pause, long and clumsy. Well, you know, it was just supposed to be small, immediate family, she said, echoing Jeffrey's earlier words. My silence did the work for me. Anyway, she said quickly, I'll send you some of the photos. Maybe you can help me decide which ones to frame. I ended the call with a polite goodbye and sat back down, pulse drumming in my throat. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had rewritten me. Turned me from participant to outsider, from partner to footnote. And the worst part? They expected me to stay grateful for it. That evening, I printed the photos she posted online. I laid them out across the dining table like a case file. Jeffrey laughing with his sister. Margaret clinking glasses with David. Christina posing in front of a balloon arch I had paid for. In none of them was there room for me. The next morning, I left the photos on the dining table where Jeffrey couldn't miss them. I didn't mention them, didn't hover, didn't explain. When he walked in from the bedroom, still groggy and rubbing sleep from his eyes, he froze at the sight. Where did these come from? He asked, voice tight, as he picked up one of Christina's smiling next to their mother. I looked up from my laptop and said calmly, Instagram. He shuffled through the images, his fingers slowing as recognition set in. You printed these? He asked, trying to sound neutral but failing. They're good shots, I replied, keeping my eyes on the screen. I refused to feed the discomfort simmering behind his furrowed brow. Didn't know you had time to go through them, I added, flipping the power dynamic one quiet word at a time. Jeffrey didn't respond at first, just sat down with the photos spread out like puzzle pieces. Christina said she was going to thank you for the photographer, he said, as if that absolved him. She did, I answered, voice clipped. Also said you told her I had a work conflict. The lie hung between us, heavy and obvious. He leaned back in the chair, eyes shifting toward the kitchen. I didn't know what else to say. She asked why you weren't there. I closed my laptop slowly. You could have told the truth, I said. That I wasn't invited. That I funded a celebration I wasn't even supposed to see. Jeffrey looked like he wanted to argue, but no words came. It was the first time I saw the gap between who he thought he was and what he had become. His silence didn't feel like guilt. It felt like the absence of a defense. It wasn't my call, he tried. Christina wanted it small. Small enough to exclude the woman paying for it? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Small enough to erase your wife, but big enough to include your childhood neighbor and your cousin's girlfriend? He winced. You don't understand how my family works, he muttered. I stood, collecting the photos into a neat stack. No, I said softly, but I finally understand how I've been used. He didn't stop me as I left the room, which said more than if he had shouted. I wasn't trying to pick a fight. I was documenting silence. I returned to my office, closing the door with a finality that made even the hardwood floorboards feel complicit. It was time to finish what I had started. I spent the weekend drafting my own version of a financial restructuring. I moved funds into a new account under my name only, adjusting the automatic payments accordingly. The mortgage, utilities, and shared necessities would remain covered, but the discretionary money, the dinners, the gifts, the boutique dreams, was no longer accessible. I left behind just enough to reveal the gaps. By Monday morning, Jeffrey noticed. Hey, did something happen with the joint account? He asked casually, over toast. The balance looked off, I shrugged. I did some reorganizing. We'll go over it Saturday, like we said. He blinked, clearly unprepared for me to follow through on what he assumed was an empty threat. At work, I felt more focused than I had in months. The Morrison account had reached its final approval stage, and my team was thriving. My assistant Rima handed me the latest reports with a proud grin. "They want you to present directly to the board," she said. "You're officially the reason they chose Fletcher." That evening, I poured a glass of wine and returned to the office. I stared at the emails I had sent myself, organizing them into folders labeled with names: Christina, Margaret, Michael. Each one contained screenshots, receipts, and notes. I wasn't just building a case. I was writing a memoir no one could deny. At dinner, Jeffrey offered to cook. I let him, watching silently as he moved through the kitchen. "Trying something new," he said, plating salmon and roasted vegetables. "Felt like we needed a reset." I nodded politely, but didn't offer praise. Halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat. "Do you think we've been drifting?" he asked. "You seem distant lately." I tilted my head. Not in confusion, but in calculation. "You mean since the dinner I funded but wasn't invited to?" He winced again, the second time in 3 days. "I was wrong," he admitted softly. "I should have said something. I didn't know how to fix it without making it worse." I stabbed a carrot with my fork. "You didn't think it was a problem until the card got declined." That shut him up faster than anything else had. He pushed his plate aside and looked at me across the table. "What do you want, Nicole? Just tell me." I swallowed slowly, then said, "I want accountability, not just an apology. A pattern this long doesn't break overnight." Jeffrey nodded slowly, the realization finally sinking in. "Okay," he said. "Then tell me where to start." I stood from the table and carried my plate to the sink, letting him sit with the silence he used to fill with excuses. I had no interest in guiding a grown man through decency. That night, he didn't come to bed right away. I heard him pacing, heard drawers opening, papers rustling. Maybe he was starting his own audit. Maybe he was finally seeing the cracks I'd stopped hiding. I fell asleep with the same thought repeating in my mind: use does not equal value. By Wednesday, I had booked a private consultation with my financial advisor under the guise of updating retirement goals. She didn't blink when I laid out the real reason. "I need asset protection and long-term autonomy," I told her, handing over the files I had compiled. She read in silence for several minutes, her pen frozen mid-air. "You're not just managing your finances, Nicole," she said softly. "You're managing your way out." It wasn't the first time someone had recognized what I hadn't yet admitted aloud. I wasn't just organizing statements or limiting discretionary spending. I was building a door where there had only been walls. And Jeffrey, for all his talk of resetting, hadn't noticed the hinges being installed. He still assumed I would balance the books and swallow the disrespect. That Friday, Margaret called. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but answered anyway, curious what role she decided to play this time. "Nicole, dear," she began, syrupy as ever. "We're planning a small brunch to celebrate Christina's dress fitting. Nothing fancy, just family." My hand tightened around the phone. "Oh," I said, feigning innocence. "Is this another, just family, event like the engagement dinner?" Her silence was brief, but revealing. "That wasn't my decision, Nicole," she said, her tone shifting quickly to defense. "Christina wanted something intimate." I smiled bitterly, unseen on my end of the line. "I understand," I said, "and I hope she's covering the costs this time, considering how intimate she likes to keep things." Margaret sniffed disapprovingly. "Well, we were hoping you could help with the flowers again. You always have such great taste." I almost laughed. "I'll pass," I said flatly. "I think it's time someone else handled that." The following evening, Jeffrey tried to test my new boundaries. "Do you mind if I use the joint card for dinner with the Montgomery group?" he asked. I paused mid-sip of tea. "That depends," I said. "Have you secured a contract with them, or is this another potential lead?" He faltered. "They're interested," he said, "but it's a relationship-building phase." I set my cup down and met his eyes. "Then it sounds like a personal investment, not a shared expense. Use your own funds." He stared at me, clearly unaccustomed to hearing no in his own kitchen. "It's just dinner," he muttered. "And it's just money," I replied. "But it's mine." His jaw clenched, the mask slipping for a moment. "You're being unfair." No, I said evenly. I'm being precise. He stood there for a few seconds, torn between arguing and retreating. Eventually, he chose the latter, muttering something about needing to, quote, reevaluate everything. I didn't respond. I'd been reevaluating for months. The next morning, I woke to a deposit notification on my phone. Jeffrey had transferred $250 into the joint account with the memo, for dinner, reimbursed. It wasn't much, but it was the first financial gesture with accountability attached. I took a screenshot and filed it in a new folder called Signs of Change. I wasn't holding my breath, but I wasn't dismissing the effort either. At Fletcher & Associates, things moved fast. I was officially being considered for the senior vice president role. My mentor, Elise, pulled me aside after a strategy meeting. Nicole, the board sees your value, she said. We just need to know you're ready to lead on your terms. I didn't hesitate. I am, I said. And I've never been more clear about what I will and won't accept, at work or at home. Elise smiled knowingly. Good, she said. Then start behaving like the person you want them to promote. Back home, I began to do just that. I stopped waiting for Jeffrey to ask about my day and volunteered nothing. If he wanted to be part of my world, he would have to walk through the front door, not peek through the windows. I planned my days around myself, not around what he might need or forget. I moved through the apartment like it belonged entirely to me, which, in most financial senses, it did. Sunday came with a knock at our door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Christina stood on the other side, holding a white envelope. Can we talk? She asked, sounding almost nervous. I nodded once and stepped aside. She sat on the edge of the sofa like it might bite her. I wanted to apologize, she began. Not just for the dinner, but for all of it. The boutique launch, the parties, the way I've treated you. I said nothing, letting her speak without rescue. I didn't realize how much you were doing behind the scenes until David pointed it out. That caught my attention. David? I asked, raising an eyebrow. He's observant, she admitted. He said it was weird that the person doing all the work was never in the pictures. Her eyes dropped to the envelope. I wanted to give you this. Inside was a check. Not large enough to erase everything, but a gesture. It's partial repayment, she said, for the boutique help. I can't afford the full value yet, but it's a start. I stared at the paper, heart heavy with conflicting feelings. Part of me wanted to reject it, to say it was too late, but the other part of me saw a door opening. Thank you, I said finally. Let's not make a habit of confusing gratitude with assumption. Christina nodded, her eyes glossy. I won't, she whispered. Not anymore. She left a few minutes later, quieter than she had arrived. I watched her go, then returned to the kitchen, envelope in hand. I slid it into the Signs of Change folder. Maybe these weren't miracles, but they were markers. Evidence that standing firm had weight, that boundaries, when respected, could become bridges. I wasn't rebuilding my marriage, not yet, but I was rebuilding myself. On Monday morning, Jeffrey was already in the kitchen when I emerged, dressed for a client pitch. He glanced up from his tablet, eyes flicking to the envelope I had tucked into my bag. Was that Christina at the door yesterday? He asked, trying to sound casual. I nodded as I poured my coffee. She came to apologize. He set his tablet down a little too quickly. Apologize? He echoed. For what? I met his eyes evenly. For letting me fund her life while acting like I didn't exist. He didn't respond, but his fingers tapped an anxious rhythm on the countertop. Did she say anything else? I shook my head. Nothing you don't already know, Jeffrey. I picked up my bag and headed for the door. We'll talk later, after I close an actual deal. At the office, the air buzzed with the energy of big opportunity. My team was prepping for a campaign review with a billion-dollar logistics firm that had shortlisted Fletcher & Associates. I led the meeting with a steady hand, every word landing with the clarity of someone who no longer second-guessed herself. Afterward, Elise caught me in the hallway and gave me a nod. SVP might come sooner than we think. That night, I returned home to find Jeffrey in the living room surrounded by printouts, budget spreadsheets, vendor quotes, even old bank statements. He looked up as I entered, his expression cautious but not defensive. "I've been going through everything," he said, "trying to see what you've been seeing." I sat down across from him without a word. "You were right," he said after a pause, "about how I've been using our finances. About how I've been using you." I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear where this was going. I wasn't even tracking what I spent. "That much was clear," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He nodded, eyes on the paper in his hands. "I've already canceled 2 subscriptions I don't need. And I'm moving forward with a part-time contract from a former client." My eyebrows lifted slightly. "A real contract?" He nodded. "Monthly retainer, starting next week." It was a start, not a solution. I would need to see more than a check to believe the change was sustainable. But part of me, the exhausted part, wanted to hope. Not for him, but for myself. Hope that my choices were causing real momentum. "Good," I said, standing. "Send me the invoice summary. I want it in writing." On Wednesday, Margaret called again, this time with a different tone. "Nicole," she said, skipping the usual niceties, "I heard you had some kind of confrontation with Christina." I sighed and leaned against the kitchen counter. "We had a conversation, Margaret, something that tends to happen when adults take accountability." "She's upset," Margaret continued, tone clipped. "She said you made her feel like a charity case." I almost laughed. That's ironic, considering I was the one writing the checks. Margaret didn't reply right away. "You know," she said after a beat, "this attitude isn't helping anyone. Families move on. They forgive." I smiled tightly. "Funny, families also invite each other to dinners. They ask before spending someone else's money. They say thank you." The phone was quiet for a moment then. Maybe we all need to reflect. I didn't bother responding. I was done trying to teach grown adults how respect worked. If they wanted a relationship, they could start from the beginning, with honesty and equality. On Friday, Jeffrey surprised me with a small dinner. Nothing fancy, just roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, and a bottle of wine from the rack I had stocked months ago. He had even lit a candle. "No expectations," he said when I sat down. "Just acknowledgement." We ate in relative silence, not uncomfortable, but not close either. "Did you talk to Margaret?" I asked after a while. He nodded. "She's in damage control mode?" I smirked. "She can join the club." Jeffrey reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "It's a budget," he said. "Personal and professional. I want your feedback." I unfolded it and scanned the figures. For once, they weren't aspirational. They were grounded. "You left room for error," I noted. "And savings." He nodded. "I'm tired of pretending." I didn't say it, but so was I. Tired of being the only adult in a room full of people playing house. The next morning, I made a quiet decision. If Jeffrey could sustain this shift for 60 days, real change, not performance, I'd consider couples counseling. Not to fix what was broken, but to figure out if anything was left worth mending. I didn't tell him this plan. Letting someone earn your trust means they work for it in silence. At the office, Rima handed me a thick envelope. "From the board," she whispered with a grin. Inside was an official offer, senior vice president, with a bonus incentive and a relocation package if I ever wanted to transfer divisions. I held the letter in my hands and felt something unshakable inside me settle. That evening, I told Jeffrey. "I got promoted," I said, handing him the envelope. He read it carefully, jaw tightening just slightly. "You earned this," he said quietly. "I hope they know how lucky they are." I studied his face and saw the flicker of envy give way to something almost like respect. "They will," I said, "because I'm not afraid to walk away when I'm being underestimated." The words weren't a threat. They were a reminder. Jeffrey nodded once. Message received. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection in the soft light. My promotion hadn't changed how I looked, but it had changed how I saw myself. I adjusted the lapel of my blazer, the same one I'd worn the day I signed my first six-figure client. This time, though, I didn't feel like I was dressing up for a role. I felt like I had arrived. When I stepped into the living room, Jeffrey was seated at the dining table, coffee in hand, watching me carefully. "You look powerful," he said, not smiling, just stating a fact. I gave him a nod and grabbed my keys from the counter. "I am," I replied, voice even, no performance. He looked like he wanted to say more, but I walked out before he could. Power wasn't about volume, it was about clarity. At work, congratulations flooded in from every direction. Elise handed me a handwritten note that simply read, "You stopped waiting for permission." I carried those words with me through every meeting that day. When I returned home that evening, the apartment was spotless and smelled faintly of lemon polish. Jeffrey had made dinner again, a simple stir-fry, and served it without commentary. As we ate, he broke the silence. "I had lunch with Michael today," he said, not meeting my eyes. I raised an eyebrow. "Did he ask for money again?" Jeffrey shook his head. "No. He wanted to know how I was managing now that you've pulled the plug." I smirked. "And what did you tell him?" Jeffrey finally looked at me. "I told him I'm learning to pay my own way. That being embarrassed in front of a client might have been the best thing that's happened to me. That caught my attention more than I expected." "Is that what you really think?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "I thought you humiliated me, Nicole, but you were just showing me the mirror I refused to look into." I leaned back, considering his words, surprised by their weight. "Michael doesn't agree," he added. "He said I should have put my foot down, that I let you control too much." I laughed softly. "Michael is a dependent with opinions. He's been starting over since 2015. Jeffrey chuckled, the tension loosening slightly between us. "But I told him the truth," Jeffrey continued, "that I lost track of what partnership was supposed to mean." I didn't respond right away, letting him sit in the discomfort of that admission. "I always assumed you'd cover things because you could," he said. "I never stopped to think whether you should have to." "I know," I said. "The problem is, you didn't think at all." He didn't flinch. "Not until it cost me my pride in front of clients. I hate that it had to happen like that." I nodded once. "Sometimes it takes a public fall to feel the weight of your private neglect." The next few weeks were quieter. Jeffrey didn't ask for money, didn't charge anything to the joint card, and submitted a basic contribution toward our bills every Friday. It wasn't much, but it was consistent. I kept receipts of everything, not because I didn't trust him, but because I trusted myself more. I'd learned that love wasn't proof against mismanagement. Christina sent me another check 2 weeks later. Smaller than the first, but again unprompted. "Just a bit from last month's profits," her note read. "I'm budgeting now." You were right about that, too. I deposited it without fanfare. Margaret, however, hadn't let go of her narrative. She called again after hearing from Jeffrey's cousin that I had cut the family off. "I didn't cut anyone off," I corrected. "I just stopped being the invisible purse." She huffed, clearly displeased with my choice of words. "Families support each other," she insisted, the same tired script. "I agree," I said. "Support should be mutual." Her silence told me she hadn't expected that answer. If support only flows one way, it's not love, it's dependency. She hung up shortly after, frustrated and unprepared for this version of me. I didn't mourn the call ending. In fact, I felt lighter. Their discomfort was not my responsibility. Their discomfort came from change, and I wasn't changing back. One night, Jeffrey surprised me by returning home with a manila folder. "My first real contract," he said, placing it gently on the kitchen counter. "Consulting project with a logistics firm. 6-month retainer. It's not massive, but it's mine." I opened the folder and skimmed the agreement. The numbers were modest, but realistic. No inflated expectations, no vanity expenses tucked into the budget. "Congratulations," I said, handing it back. "Now make it count." He nodded, expression serious. "I will." I studied him for a moment, still unsure whether this was a new version or just a temporary performance. But the contract was real, and that mattered. For now, action had replaced apology. The next weekend, Jeffrey's parents invited us both to dinner. It was the first formal family invitation I had received in over a year. I considered declining, unsure if I wanted to cross back into their carefully curated circle. But something inside me shifted. I needed to see how it would feel, to walk in not as the benefactor, but as the equal. I wore a navy sheath dress and a calm expression. When we arrived, Margaret greeted us with a strained smile. "Nicole, thank you for coming," she said. I nodded, offering a cool, "Thanks for the invitation." The room quieted slightly as we entered. Dinner was awkward at first. Michael barely met my eyes, and Christina looked like she was waiting for a scolding. But I wasn't there to lecture anyone. I passed the bread, commented on the wine, and politely answered questions about my promotion. When someone asked if I'd help Jeffrey with his new contract, I simply said, he handled it himself. And that was the truth. Dinner at Margaret's felt like a theater production, where everyone had forgotten their lines. The usual dominance of Jeffrey's voice had been replaced by tentative nods and polite questions aimed at me. Michael sat across the table, unusually quiet, pushing food around his plate without offering unsolicited advice. Christina, seated to my left, glanced at me several times before finally mustering the courage to speak. "The boutique is launching a spring line," she said. "We're keeping it simple, local designers only." I nodded once, taking a sip of wine. "Sounds smart," I replied. "Keep overhead low and margin high." Her shoulders dropped slightly in what looked like relief. "Would love to show you the lookbook sometime," she added. "Your feedback really helped us avoid a lot of mistakes last year." Jeffrey's father, Richard, cleared his throat. "Heard about the promotion," he said, turning to me. "Senior vice president now, isn't it?" I smiled softly. "Yes, officially 2 weeks in." He nodded, raising his glass. "Impressive. Took me 30 years to get there in my firm." The compliment hung in the air like rare gold. It wasn't effusive, but it was the first time Richard had acknowledged my career without comparing it to Jeffrey's ambitions. Margaret forced a smile. "We're very proud of both of you," she said. I didn't reply. I wasn't going to pretend equality where there hadn't been any. After dinner, while the others migrated to the living room, Christina pulled me aside near the hallway. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said earnestly. "I know things have been weird." I raised an eyebrow. "Weird is one word for it." She nodded quickly, looking at the floor. "I'm trying to be better." I noticed. I said, and I meant it. The checks, the apology, the toned-down wedding plans, small but consistent. "Keep doing the work," I added. "Words are easy. Change is expensive." Christina gave a tiny nod, her eyes damp. As we left the house that night, Jeffrey reached for my hand. I let him take it, not because everything was forgiven, but because he hadn't asked for it in weeks. The gesture felt quiet, almost reverent, and I allowed it. Outside, the air was cool and clear, the kind of night that made the city feel generous again. "That went better than I expected," he murmured. "Because expectations were low," I replied. He chuckled softly. "Fair point." We walked in silence the rest of the way to the car, two people aware that peace wasn't the same as progress, but it was something. I didn't let go of his hand until we reached the apartment elevator. That week, Jeffrey submitted his first invoice to his new client and received a direct deposit 3 days later. It wasn't large, but it was clean and earned. He showed me the amount without fanfare and added, "Transferred half to the joint account." I checked and confirmed it before nodding. "Keep it consistent," I said. "No more surprises." His routines began to shift. Less time scrolling, more time working. Fewer networking events, more deliverables. He still had moments of wandering optimism, but now they came with spreadsheets instead of dreams. I documented everything in a private journal, not to punish him, but to remind myself that people are patterns, not promises. On Saturday, Margaret called again, this time with an actual request. "Christina wants help drafting the campaign for her spring launch," she said. "Would you be open to consulting?" "Formally, of course." I paused, considering. "As in paid consultation?" Margaret hesitated. "Yes," she said slowly. Christina insisted. I asked for Christina's direct contact and ended the call with a polite goodbye. When Christina emailed me that afternoon, she included a detailed outline and a proposed fee, modest but real. I replied with a contract template and payment terms. When the signed agreement came through, I added the invoice to my firm's secondary portfolio. I didn't give her a discount. Sunday came with sunlight and silence, and I sat on the balcony with a book and a glass of orange juice. Jeffrey emerged mid-morning and sat across from me, a folder in his lap. "I've started drafting a business plan," he said. "Not just proposals, an actual model." I didn't ask for proof, I waited. He slid the folder over to me, the paper still warm from the printer. It outlined service tiers, pricing strategies, competitive analysis, and a 6-month timeline for acquiring clients. "I want your opinion," he said quietly, "not as my wife, as someone I respect." I looked up at him, surprised but unmoved. "Then you'll get honest feedback," I said. "Don't ask for it unless you're ready to hear it." He nodded once, eyes steady. "I am." As I read, I found flaws, minor ones, but present. I marked them with a pen, circled weak assumptions, and added questions in the margins. When I handed it back, he scanned the notes and winced. "Brutal," he muttered. "But fair," I replied, "and far better than where you started." He closed the folder, tucking it under one arm. "Thank you," I shrugged. "That's what consultants do." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe you're the best investment I never paid for, until now." I didn't smile. I didn't joke. I simply looked at him and said, "Just make sure I'm not the only one getting paid this time." His nod was slower this time, but deeper. Maybe he was finally beginning to understand the cost of convenience. By mid-April, Christina's campaign had gone live, and the numbers were solid. She texted me a screenshot of her web traffic metrics with 3 exclamation points and a line that read, "Your strategy worked." I replied with a thumbs-up emoji and the words, "Glad to see the data align with the plan." It wasn't cold, it was professional. She responded quickly, offering to book more hours next month. I told her I'd send an updated contract if she was serious. She was learning, slowly but surely, the difference between family favors and professional services. I kept the boundaries firm but open. Christina didn't push, and that was progress in itself. Meanwhile, Jeffrey completed his first full billing cycle without overdrawing the account or asking me for a supplement. He even declined 2 networking events, citing ROI concerns in a way that sounded like he finally meant it. One afternoon, I came home to find him in the second bedroom, his so-called office, measuring wall space. "Thinking of putting up a whiteboard," he said. "Helps me visualize project flows." I raised an eyebrow. "And the post-its all over your desk lost their charm?" He chuckled. "Something like that." It was strange watching him mature professionally in front of me, like observing a time-lapse of someone catching up to their own potential. Still, I wasn't ready to label it permanent change. I had learned the hard way that improvement needed consistency, not flair. He wasn't asking for praise anymore, though, and that shift felt genuine. I logged the whiteboard idea under effort acknowledged. The next family event was a Sunday brunch hosted at a local bistro. Christina sent the invite directly, no group messages, no proxy through Jeffrey. "It's just us, siblings and partners," she'd said. "No big announcements, no business talk unless you bring it up." I RSVP'd yes, but didn't confirm until the morning of. When we arrived, the table was already half full. Michael nodded stiffly and Margaret looked like she was trying hard to look relaxed. Richard offered me the seat beside him, which I accepted without hesitation. The menus were already on the table, and someone had pre-ordered mimosas for everyone. "We thought it was time to just spend time together without any drama," Christina said as we sat. For the first time, no one asked me about work to be impressed, or ignored me to be dismissive. We talked about books, travel plans, and even favorite brunch spots, without turning it into a networking pitch. Jeffrey stayed mostly quiet, inserting the occasional remark when it added something meaningful. I watched him carefully, noting how he deferred when appropriate and didn't interrupt to center himself. That version of him, measured, quiet, engaged, was new. At one point, Margaret brought up her garden renovation. "We're thinking of hiring someone this year. Richard's knees can't handle the weeding anymore." She glanced at me, then quickly looked away, as if catching herself. I didn't offer to help. I wasn't there to volunteer my project management skills over French toast. Christina raised her glass midway through the meal. "I just want to say thank you," she said, "to everyone here for showing up. It hasn't always been easy, but I'm glad we're finding our way back." Her eyes flicked to me for just a second longer than anyone else's. I lifted my glass in acknowledgement, but said nothing. Back home, Jeffrey looked over at me as I changed out of my shoes. "That was different," I nodded. Fewer apologies, more listening. He leaned on the doorway, watching me. "You think it's going to last?" "I think it's finally started," I said. "Whether it lasts is up to them." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Up to us, too." I didn't argue, but I also didn't promise anything I wasn't sure of. That week, Fletcher and Associates invited me to keynote an upcoming industry panel. Elise had submitted my name quietly, knowing I wouldn't volunteer myself. "They want someone who rebuilt a brand and a backbone," she told me. I laughed. "That's one way to phrase it," she grinned. "They want the woman who pulled the plug and made the lights brighter." I accepted the invitation, blocking time on my calendar and beginning to draft my speech. It wouldn't be about revenge or even empowerment, not directly. It would be about clarity and the economics of dignity, about how being needed doesn't mean being valued, about how the most important audits are personal. One night, as I rehearsed quietly in the office, Jeffrey stood outside the door. "Can I sit in?" he asked. I considered for a moment before nodding. "Sure. Just listen. Don't respond." He sat in the armchair without speaking. I delivered the opening 5 minutes of my keynote, pausing only to take small sips of water. I spoke of partnerships that disguise dependencies, of generosity mistaken for obligation. I spoke of transactions we don't realize we're making until the emotional overdraft hits. When I stopped, he looked at me and said, "That was hard to hear." I nodded. "It was harder to live." Later that week, Jeffrey received news that his client had renewed his contract and referred him to a second company. "It's not a big firm," he said, showing me the email, "but they said my proposal felt professional. Said I seem like someone who understands balance." I looked up from my laptop. "Let's hope you keep it that way." He didn't bristle. He just nodded. "I intend to." I wanted to believe him, and more than that, I wanted him to believe himself. We didn't toast the win. We logged it. Because wins only matter if you build on them. The morning of the keynote, I dressed with intention. Charcoal blazer, cream blouse, hair pinned back, heels that meant business. Jeffrey stood in the doorway watching me buckle the strap on my watch, a soft smile barely tugging at his lips. "You look like someone no one should underestimate," he said. I glanced at him briefly in the mirror. They shouldn't have been underestimating me in the first place. He offered to drive me to the venue, but I declined. I needed the solitude of the back seat in a car that wasn't shared, needed the silence before I stepped into a room where my story would no longer be private. As the city passed by outside the window, I thought about every overlooked moment, every unreciprocated gesture, and I didn't feel bitter. I felt equipped. Not because I had been wronged, but because I had survived it with records and receipts. The event hall buzzed with executives, entrepreneurs, and rising stars in marketing. When I stepped onto the stage, the lights hit me like sunlight through clean glass. Clarifying but not blinding, my speech was sharp, not angry. I spoke of balance sheets and emotional equity, of self-invoicing when no one else sends payment. By the time I stepped down, the applause wasn't loud. It was respectful, focused, real. Elise met me backstage with a look of fierce satisfaction. "You didn't just deliver a keynote," she said. "You drew a blueprint." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. "I'm done explaining my value," I told her. "From now on, I just invoice." Back at the apartment that evening, I found Jeffrey in the kitchen, making pasta. "I watched the live stream," he said without looking up. "You didn't name me, but I heard myself in it." I set my bag down on the counter. "Good," I said. "Now maybe others will hear themselves too." He handed me a glass of wine, the good bottle, unopened since Christmas. "I want to make something clear," he said, voice quieter now. "Whatever comes next, whether we rebuild this or not, I'm not going back. I studied him carefully. Not going back to what? To the man who expected you to carry everything while I performed success, he replied. To the man who mistook your silence for agreement. I didn't nod. Didn't offer comfort. He didn't need absolution. He needed a sustained track record. Change, like interest, compounds only with consistency. We ate dinner in relative silence, interrupted only by the clink of cutlery and the occasional shift in our breathing. I didn't know if we were heading toward repair or resolution. I only knew that for once, the weight on the table was evenly distributed. When he did the dishes without prompting, I simply noted it. The days of rewarding basic competence were over. A week later, Christina sent over her updated contract for a summer collaboration. The fee was higher this time, and she'd included a clause for scope revision. Trying to do things the right way, she wrote in the email. I reviewed it line by line before sending back my approval and invoice. She responded promptly with payment confirmation. Michael, on the other hand, had gone silent. I suspected he'd been told to stay out of things for the time being. Margaret texted once, a vague, "Hope you're well," with no follow-up. I didn't reply. Silence was now a form of currency I was comfortable spending. By June, Jeffrey's second client had signed a 3-month retainer. He didn't make a big announcement about it, just transferred the partial payment and updated our shared spreadsheet. I scheduled the quarterly review like you asked, he said one evening, handing me a printout of his expense log. I used your formatting. I took the papers without commentary. Later that night, as I cross-referenced receipts and entries, I found everything aligned. No hidden charges, no unexplained dinners, no vanity expenses tucked in the margins. I checked the calculations twice, then filed the document. It was the most boring financial review we'd ever had, and I was deeply, unexpectedly pleased by that. On a rainy Thursday morning, I received a call from a local university requesting a guest lecture on brand ethics. Apparently, someone had forwarded them my keynote. We want students to understand that career integrity isn't just about what you do, it's about what you allow. The dean explained. I agreed, calendar already open. Teaching the next generation how not to get erased felt more urgent than another client pitch. That night, I told Jeffrey about it while we made separate dinners side by side. You're becoming a voice, he said, eyes on the skillet. More than a title, more than a role. You're turning into a standard. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. But the silence that followed felt warm, not empty. Saturday morning brought an unexpected delivery. Flowers, white peonies with a small note. Thank you for showing me how to be visible. Not for you, because of you. It wasn't signed, but I knew Christina's handwriting. I placed the bouquet on the dining table and left the note folded beneath the vase. I wasn't going to frame apologies, but I could acknowledge the ones that arrived unprompted. That evening, Jeffrey returned from a meeting with a new lead, soaked from the rain but smiling. They said they'd heard about me from Harrison's team, he said, pulling off his wet jacket. Apparently I'm low drama, high delivery. I raised an eyebrow. Sounds like someone else I know, he laughed. Guess I'm finally learning from the best. We shared a quiet dinner, no music, no distractions. For once, it didn't feel like we were navigating a minefield. We talked about practical things. Air conditioning repairs, grocery rotation, vacation days. Nothing grand. Nothing fragile. When I went to bed that night, I scrolled through my old spreadsheet. The one I'd made the night his card had been declined. I didn't delete it, but for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to update it. That chapter was still part of my ledger, but it wasn't the whole story anymore. July arrived with a quiet heat that made the city feel slower, more deliberate. I spent my early mornings on the balcony, coffee in hand, reviewing contracts and drafting outlines for my upcoming university lecture. Jeffrey started joining me, not always talking, but present, which was new. Sometimes he read industry newsletters or sketched service models in his notebook. Other times he just sat beside me, letting the silence stretch in a way that didn't feel heavy. The summer campaign I designed for Christina was outperforming projections, and she sent over a revised contract for Q4. You were right about focusing on seasonal pivoting, her email read. Also added a clause to increase your rate. Fair is fair. I didn't gush or send hearts, just responded with a confirmation and updated terms. Mutual respect was beginning to take root where obligation used to grow. The university sent a formal flyer for my lecture, and I framed it on the shelf near my desk. When I mentioned it to Margaret during a brief phone call, she responded with something resembling genuine curiosity. "They asked you to teach," she said, before catching herself. "I mean, of course they did. You've always had a talent for explaining things." I didn't reply with sarcasm. Some wins don't need applause to be meaningful. That week, Jeffrey and I had our first honest discussion about the future, not just bills and logistics, but marriage, equity, and boundaries. "You never stopped being married," he said. "But I stopped being a husband when I started treating you like infrastructure." I appreciated the metaphor more than I expected. "Infrastructure breaks down when it's overused and undermaintained," I said. "Ask any city planner." He didn't argue, didn't deflect. "If you ever decided to walk away, I'd understand now in a way I couldn't before." I looked at him then, really looked, not through disappointment, but through clarity. "I didn't want to leave you, Jeffrey. I wanted to stop leaving myself." His eyes dropped, but he nodded, and that was enough. The next family gathering came in late July, an anniversary dinner for Richard and Margaret at their home. The invitation was sent directly to both of us, not filtered through group chats or assumptions. When we arrived, Margaret greeted me at the door with an awkward hug that, for the first time, didn't feel performative. "I'm glad you came," she said. "We have wine, good wine this time." Christina had set the table, and there was a place card with my name spelled correctly. Richard toasted early in the evening, thanking everyone for showing up, and added, "Nicole, your professionalism has changed how this family moves. I hope we've started showing up better." I didn't cry, didn't beam. I nodded. "Progress shows in the unspoken details," I said. And that was all that needed to be said. Michael was unusually quiet throughout the meal, only offering a few grunts and the occasional comment about sports. I let him be. Some people evolve through accountability. Others just shrink into silence when growth becomes the new currency. Christina brought out a cake she'd ordered from a bakery I once recommended, and she looked at me as she sliced it. "You're the reason I even knew this place existed," she said. It's about time I acknowledged that out loud. Back at home, Jeffrey placed the framed university flyer on the mantel. "You know," he said, "I used to introduce you as someone with a good job. Now I tell people you're the standard." I sat on the armrest beside him, knees drawn up, sipping water from my favorite mug. "Titles don't matter to me anymore," I said. "Terms do." He didn't flinch. He just nodded. "Then let's agree on new ones." The conversation that followed wasn't romantic, but it was foundational. We drafted a household contract, shared expenses, agreed contributions, emergency plans, and discretionary budgets. I added a clause about emotional labor. We'd discuss workloads every 2 weeks. He initialed every line. August brought the start of a part-time mentorship program I'd volunteered to lead, and with it came long evenings of reviewing portfolios and career plans. Jeffrey surprised me by prepping dinner on those nights without being asked. No grand gestures, just meals and silence when I needed it. It wasn't gratitude, it was partnership. One evening he paused while loading the dishwasher and said, "I used to think making things easier for you meant shielding you from stress. Now I know it means not adding to it." I didn't say anything, just walked over and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. I wasn't forgiving him, I was acknowledging that learning had occurred. That was enough for now. We weren't back to before. We were somewhere else entirely. When the boutique's fall preview launched, Christina invited me to the event with a printed invite inside a small gold envelope. It included a line that read, "Special thanks to our strategy consultant, Nicole Richardson, whose vision helped make this line possible." I smiled when I read it, not for the credit, but for the absence of assumption. I attended, stayed for exactly 90 minutes, then left before the after-party began. I had learned the value of a defined exit. The fall came with cooler mornings and longer meetings, but I no longer carried resentment like a second laptop. The joint account stayed balanced. Jeffrey's clients paid on time. Margaret sent me a birthday card with a handwritten note that didn't mention Jeffrey at all. And Michael finally emailed to request consulting, through Christina's referral, with a formal proposal attached. I didn't say yes. Some patterns didn't deserve to restart, even under new management. And that was the final clarity. Not everything that repairs deserves return. Growth isn't measured by how quickly we rebuild what broke, but by what we refuse to reconstruct. My marriage wasn't a recovery, it was a rewrite. And I had become the author this time, not the footnote. Thank you for listening to Nicole's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.